Reid's life hummed with the predictable drone of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clack of a keyboard. His apartment, a compact space overlooking a brick wall, offered little more than shelter from the city's constant thrum. Each morning brought the same measured steps, coffee brewing, news headlines skimmed, a brisk walk to the train station. He was a creature of habit, not by choice, but by the quiet inertia of a life that had never demanded more. Determination was a muscle he rarely exercised, but it was there, a deep-seated stubbornness beneath the surface. He filed documents, answered emails, and watched the clock with a quiet resignation, always half expecting, half dreading, something to shatter the routine. The shattering came in the form of a crisp, embossed envelope, delivered not by the usual postal worker, but by a courier in a dark uniform. It lay on his worn kitchen table, an anomalous rectangle of heavy cream cardstock against the scarred wood. Inside, a letter, formal and precise, bore the letterhead of a regional legal firm. It spoke of probate, of an estate, and of a distant relative named Elara Vance, a name that chimed no bells in the echoing chambers of Reid's memory. He read it twice, then a third time, each word settling like an unfamiliar stone in his gut. Elara Vance, deceased. The inheritance, a property. An old cabin. Deep within the Blackwood Forest. He remembered a fleeting mention from his grandmother, years ago, about some eccentric great-aunt who went to live among the trees. It had been dismissed as family folklore, a quaint anecdote. Now, it was a physical address, a deed, and a key. He barely knew the woman. Why him? A week later, Reid packed a single duffel bag. The city had begun to feel claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken expectations. The cabin, remote and isolated, suddenly held an unexpected allure, a promise of escape. He gassed up his car, a reliable but uninspired sedan, and pointed its nose north, away from the concrete sprawl. The highway gradually thinned, shedding lanes and shedding the frantic pace of urban life. Buildings gave way to rolling hills, then to denser stands of pine. The air grew sharper, carrying the tang of damp earth and distant salt. It was here, perched precariously on a jagged promontory, that he saw it, an abandoned lighthouse. Its white paint was peeling in great, ragged swaths, revealing the rust-colored metal beneath. The lantern room, a skeletal cage of glass and iron, stood empty, a sightless eye staring out at the indifferent sea. No light, no warmth, just a silent monument to obsolescence and isolation. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, a premonition of the forgotten places he was heading towards. He drove past, the image lingering in his rearview mirror, a stark emblem of desolation. Soon after, the paved road surrendered to gravel, then to a track barely wider than his car. The forest closed in, an impenetrable wall of ancient trees whose branches laced together overhead, blotting out the sun. The world outside his windows transformed into a tapestry of greens and browns, thick with ferns and moss-covered stones. The air grew heavy, damp and smelling of decaying leaves, a scent both earthy and vaguely metallic. The GPS signal, once robust, flickered, then died, replaced by a stark, no service. He was truly alone now, guided only by the increasingly faint directions printed on the solicitor's page. After what felt like hours, the track opened into a small, overgrown clearing. And there it was. The cabin wasn't just old, it was ancient, hunched beneath the weight of centuries. The windows, small and murky with grime, stared out like vacant eyes. A rusted, skeletal porch swing hung motionless, a silent sentinel. Reid cut the engine. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was overwhelming, but underneath it, something else lingered, a faint, musty odor, like old paper and forgotten secrets. He walked towards the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. The porch groaned beneath his weight. He slid the heavy iron key into the lock. He pushed the door open. This wasn't just an old cabin, it felt like a place that had been waiting for him. The city, a sprawling beast of steel and glass, receded in Reid's rearview mirror. He drove for hours, the urban sprawl giving way to suburbs, then small towns, and finally, a dense, unbroken wall of ancient forest. The road narrowed, asphalt cracking into gravel, then into a barely discernible track swallowed by encroaching ferns and moss. He found the cabin just as the late afternoon sun began to bleed orange through the canopy. It stood, a hunched silhouette of weathered timber, partially obscured by towering hemlocks that had claimed the clearing around it. The porch sagged, its planks groaning under the weight of decades. A thick layer of dust and spiderwebs coated everything, a testament to its long abandonment. He stepped out of his vehicle, the silence of the forest pressing in, a heavy, velvet blanket. Here, the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the distant caw of a crow. Inside, the cabin was a tomb of forgotten air and decay. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through grimy windows. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each step a protest against his intrusion. He spent the first few days simply clearing out the accumulated grime, sweeping away generations of neglect. He worked with a quiet determination, his hands growing rough from scrubbing, his back aching from moving antiquated furniture. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, as he stacked firewood by the hearth, a faint scraping sound drifted from the floorboards above him. He paused, listening. The house was settling, he reasoned, old timbers adjusting to the changing temperature. He continued his work. Later, while boiling water for instant coffee, a soft thud echoed from the kitchen pantry. He peered inside, finding nothing amiss, only the familiar aroma of aged wood and a faint, musty tang. He must have left the door ajar, he told himself, and the wind had nudged it. He dismissed these occurrences, attributing them to the cabin's age, the wind, or his own fatigue. Yet, a tiny, persistent sliver of unease began to burrow beneath his skin. One morning, he discovered his reading glasses, which he distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen table, perched precariously on a shelf in the living room, amidst a collection of tarnished pewter mugs. He stared at them, a frown creasing his brow. Had he moved them subconsciously? His mind felt foggy after a night of restless sleep, punctuated by what sounded like faint, rhythmic tapping from the walls. He shook his head. He was simply disoriented, still adjusting to the isolation. The nights were the worst. The wind, when it stirred, often sounded like a sigh pressed against the window panes. Sometimes, he thought he heard a distant, mournful keen, like a lament carried on the currents of the air, only to have it vanish the moment he focused. He'd lie awake, straining his ears, the hair on his arms prickling, convinced he was imagining things. He'd tried to force it open earlier, but it resisted. Now, with a borrowed pry bar and a determined grunt, he worked the rusted clasp until it gave way with a sharp, echoing crack. A small, crudely carved wooden bird, its eyes mere pinpricks, seemed to stare up at him. Next to it lay a tarnished silver locket, heavy in his palm, and a brittle, leather-bound journal. The pages were thin, fragile, filled with cramped, faded script. He carefully opened it, the dry paper rustling like forgotten leaves. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes neat, sometimes sprawling, almost frantic. The language was archaic, filled with peculiar turns of phrase. Further in, a rough sketch caught his attention. An abandoned lighthouse. Scrawled beneath it, in a hand that looked almost desperate, were a few words: "They watch from the shore. The light is out, but they still see." Reid closed the journal slowly, the scent of old paper and something else, something subtly metallic and earthy, clinging to his fingers. The scraping sound from the floorboards upstairs returned, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap. This wasn't the wind, he knew with a sickening certainty. This wasn't the house settling. The seed of doubt had blossomed into something far more sinister. He stood frozen, the journal heavy in his grasp, the quiet cabin suddenly dense with unseen observation. The sound wasn't the frantic scurry of a mouse, nor the deliberate tread of a human. It was too light, too precise, a tiny percussion against the aged wood. He strained his ears, every muscle tensed, waiting for it to shift, to reveal itself. But the tap-tap-tap simply continued, a patient, persistent rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the old house. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Hello," he called out, his voice a reedy whisper in the oppressive stillness. The tapping stopped. Utter silence descended, heavier and more menacing than the sound itself. Reid waited, breath held, for a full minute, two. Nothing. He tried to rationalize it, a loose shutter in a sudden gust, a branch scraping against the roof, an old house settling. Yet, the air in the room felt colder, prickling his skin. He moved then, slowly, deliberately, placing the journal back on the dusty table. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the dark corners, the shadows cast by the dying afternoon light. Over the next few days, the phenomena escalated, subtle at first, then undeniably present. He'd find objects slightly askew from where he'd left them, a mug turned facing the wall, a book open to a different page, a chair pulled imperceptibly from the table. He blamed his own forgetfulness, the disorienting effect of the cabin's isolation. Faint, indistinct murmurs that would coil around the edges of his hearing, like conversations in the next room, just out of reach. The cabin, once a place of quiet solitude, was becoming a cage of unease. Reid found himself pacing, unable to focus, his gaze constantly darting, searching for the source of the subtle shifts in reality. Sleep became a fractured thing, punctuated by the creak of floorboards upstairs when he was certain he was alone, or the sensation of something brushing past him in the narrow hallway. He couldn't rationalize it away anymore. The cabin was alive, or something within it was. His distant relative's journal offered no direct answers, only cryptic warnings and mentions of the land's claim. Reid knew he needed more. He needed history, context. The local archives, housed in a back room of the town hall, were a treasure trove of dust and forgotten paper. He spent hours poring over brittle newspaper clippings, property deeds, and local historical society pamphlets. Old maps showed peculiar markings around the cabin's precise location, circles and symbols that were definitely not surveyor's marks. A series of articles from the late 1800s detailed strange crop failures and livestock illnesses on the land, followed by an unusual number of disappearances and unexplained deaths among early settlers who tried to cultivate it. Each time, the land would lie fallow for a decade or two before another family, usually newcomers, would attempt to settle, only to meet a similar fate. The deeper he delved, the more a pattern emerged, a cyclical tragedy tied to the land. But what bound his family to it? He found a mention in an old town ledger of a covenant related to the property, but the details were frustratingly absent. The archivist, a stooped older woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had merely offered him a weary smile and suggested he check the records at that abandoned lighthouse down the coast. Old Man Hemlock, the lighthouse keeper from way back, she'd rasped, he kept his own kind of history. Obsessed with local legends, he was. The abandoned lighthouse stood stark against the churning gray sea, a skeletal finger pointing to the bruised sky. Its brickwork was crumbling, windows shattered like vacant eyes, and the air around it tasted of salt and decay. The heavy, rusted iron door groaned open with a sound like a dying animal. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and brine. The top chamber, where the lantern once shone, was filled with more than just dust and broken glass. Neatly stacked against the curved wall were crates and boxes, clearly left untouched for decades. These weren't official records, but a personal archive. Hemlock's obsession. Reid began to sort through them, his fingers growing grimy with dust. The lighthouse keeper's scrawling script filled page after page with observations of the tides, weather. Then, slowly, disturbingly, of the hunger of the land. He wrote of strange fogs that rolled in only over the cabin's property, of voices carried on the wind from the forest. Of the local families who paid their due. Then, he found it. Tucked within a particularly thick, leather-bound journal, was a folded, brittle parchment. It wasn't a deed, but a formal, almost legalistic document, written in elaborate script. And beneath the formal language, in a shaky hand, was a list of names, each one accompanied by a date. The last name on the list was his distant relative's. And below it, a blank space, waiting. He had barely known his distant relative, and now this document, found deep within the cabin's hidden recesses, suggested a history far more intricate and sinister than simple inheritance. The words were archaic, almost ceremonial, hinting at obligations and consequences that sent a shiver down his spine. He reread the section that mentioned a guardian of the covenant and its sacred keeping place by the Western Bluffs. Western Bluffs. That could only mean one thing. A grim resolve settled over him. He couldn't ignore this. The cabin had already begun to twist his perception, to whisper things he couldn't explain. He needed to know what binding agreement truly meant, and what his lineage had bound themselves to. The journey to the Western Bluffs was arduous. The forest, usually a place of dappled light and rustling leaves, felt different now. The canopy seemed to press down, branches like skeletal fingers reaching for him. The path, barely more than an animal trail, wound through ancient pines, their needles forming a suffocating carpet underfoot. He pushed through the undergrowth, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of his boots and the distant, mournful cry of a seabird. The roar of the ocean, a low, constant rumble, grew louder, pulling him forward. Then, through a final stand of gnarled cypress, he saw it, the abandoned lighthouse. It stood sentinel on the edge of a sheer cliff face, a solitary, weather-beaten tower against the churning gray of the sea. Its white paint had long since peeled, revealing the rough, salt-stained stone beneath. The lantern room, once a beacon of safety, was a gaping, empty maw, its glass shattered, shards like missing teeth. The air here was sharp with salt and decay, the incessant shriek of gulls echoing off the rocks below. Reid approached the base of the lighthouse, his heart a dull thrum against his ribs. The heavy wooden door, warped and splintered, hung askew on a single rusted hinge. He pushed it open, a groan of tortured wood protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air was still and stagnant, thick with the smell of mold and old salt. A spiral staircase, wrought iron, spiraled upwards into the gloom. He ascended slowly, each creaking step a testament to the structure's age and neglect. He passed empty rooms, their contents long since plundered or rotted away. Cobwebs, thick and heavy, draped like shrouds from the ceiling. He reached the top, the lantern room, where the wind howled through the shattered panes. But there was nothing here, no journal, no hidden compartment. His gaze swept the circular room, frustration mounting. The sacred keeping place. It had to be here. He ran his hand along the rough stone wall, feeling for any irregularity. His fingers brushed against a section that felt different, slightly recessed, less coarse than the surrounding masonry. He pushed, nothing. He pressed harder, testing the stone. It was a hidden door, cleverly disguised. With renewed urgency, Reid searched for a latch, a lever. His fingers found a small, rusted iron ring, almost flush with the stone, tucked away beneath a loose piece of plaster. He pulled. He opened it, his hands trembling. The script was the same as the binding agreement, but the entries here were more personal, more horrific. They detailed a series of rituals, offerings made to the deep dweller, an entity described not as a spirit, but as an ancient, primal hunger born of the earth itself, tied inextricably to the land where the cabin stood. The lineage of Hemlock had made a pact, generations ago, to appease this entity, to feed it, ensuring their prosperity and safety at a terrible cost. He recognized a name, mentioned in passing in the cabin's original deed, a distant ancestor. The journal spoke of a cycle, of the entity's awakening, its insatiable need. The binding agreement was no legal document, it was a blood covenant, a promise of continued sustenance for something ancient and malevolent. His breath caught in his throat. The cabin, the strange phenomena, the twisting reality, it wasn't a haunting. It was a hunger, an ancient entity stirring, demanding its due. And his distant relative's death, sudden and mysterious, was not an end, but a signal. He, Reid, was the next in the lineage. He was the next offering. A low moan, like the lament of the wind, seemed to emanate not from the outside, but from the very stones of the lighthouse, from the ground beneath his feet. It was a sound that vibrated deep in his bones, a primal hum of recognition. The entity knew he was here. It knew he had found its truth. And it was waiting. The words blurred, not from fatigue, but from a sudden, profound disorientation that seized him. The cabin, which had felt merely old and isolated, now seemed to breathe around him, a living, hostile entity. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, a resonance that settled in his teeth. It wasn't the wind, nor the groaning of ancient timbers, it was deeper, an almost melodic hum that twisted into a discordant whine. The lamp on the rough-hewn table flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that stretched and warped the familiar shapes of the room. A stack of old books on a nearby shelf seemed to lean in, their spines cracking with an unheard sigh. Reid's gaze snapped up. The window, previously a rectangle of impenetrable forest black, now shimmered with a faint, greenish light. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes, convinced it was a trick of the straining lamp, but the light persisted, pulsing faintly like a dying ember. He stood, the parchment still clutched, his muscles tight. The thrum intensified, vibrating up his legs, making his knees feel loose. He could feel a pressure building behind his eyes, a dull ache that spread through his skull. He needed to talk to someone, anyone, to anchor himself to reality. He fumbled for his satellite phone, its cold, hard casing a small comfort against the encroaching strangeness. He tried his colleague first, the one who'd initially pointed him to the cabin's remote location. Then, a click. He yanked the phone from his ear, his hand trembling. He tried again, dialing a different number, a friend from the city. This time, the line was dead. The cabin wasn't just isolated, it was sealed. He was trapped. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, expecting to see something, anything. He staggered back, bumping into the large, dusty bookshelf. A small, leather-bound journal tumbled from a hidden compartment behind a loose panel. It landed with a soft thud, open to a page filled with a looping, spidery script, clearly the same hand that had penned the binding agreement. His relative's hand. He knelt, his fingers tracing the aged ink. The text was faded, but a specific entry stood out, underlined multiple times, the light calls from the western shore. The pact must be renewed where the sea meets the sky. Hemlock will guide. Below it, a crude, yet unmistakable, drawing of an old, crumbling structure. An abandoned lighthouse. Reid felt a jolt of something akin to desperate hope, but also a profound, sickening certainty that this was no coincidence. The entity wasn't just trapping him, it was guiding him. The light from the window pulsed brighter, a beacon in the encroaching gloom. He looked from the journal to the window, then back to the parchment still in his hand. The binding agreement, the journal entry, the cabin's sudden, aggressive manifestations, it was all connected. The abandoned lighthouse, miles away on the coast, was the next piece of this horrifying puzzle. He had to go. The cabin was a cage, and the entity was rattling the bars, making escape impossible while simultaneously pointing him towards another location. He grabbed a heavy coat, a worn backpack, and his car keys. The car, at least, was still outside, a familiar, solid object in this shifting reality. The trees leaned in, their branches skeletal fingers against the bruised twilight sky. The drive was a blur of heightened senses and distorted perception. The road stretched endlessly, the gravel crunching under the tires sounding like grinding teeth. The air shifted, bringing the sharp tang of salt and decay. And then, through a gap in the gnarled pines, he saw it. The abandoned lighthouse. It stood stark against the tumultuous gray sky, a skeletal finger pointing towards the roiling ocean. Its brickwork was crumbling, windows long shattered, leaving vacant eyes staring out. There was no light, no warmth, only a pervasive sense of desolation and an ancient, waiting presence. He stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. The lighthouse loomed, far larger and more menacing up close. As he approached the base, a low, resonant hum began again, louder than it had been in the cabin, vibrating through the very ground. The lighthouse itself seemed to hum, a deep, mournful tone that resonated with the fear blossoming in his chest. He saw it then, etched into the crumbling brickwork near the rusted iron door, the same stylized symbol from the binding agreement, a twisted knot resembling a hemlock branch. He was here. He had followed the breadcrumbs, led by an unseen hand. The entity wasn't just a force confined to the cabin, it was everywhere, reaching out, pulling him deeper into its web. The abandoned lighthouse wasn't an escape, it was another chamber in its trap, a place where the pact, and the lineage it bound, would finally be revealed. And he, Reid, was the next sacrifice. The words, ancient and binding, seemed to worm their way into his very bones, a chill far deeper than the cabin's perpetual damp. A pact. A lineage. Sacrifice. He wouldn't be another name etched into some forgotten, blood-soaked ledger. Not him. A fierce, desperate resolve hardened in his chest. He clutched the parchment, crumpling its dry edges slightly, then shoved it into his pocket. Escape. That was the only answer. He burst from the study, the cabin's oppressive silence a physical weight against his ears. The floorboards groaned beneath his frantic steps as he made for the front door. The old truck, parked just beyond the porch, was his ticket to freedom. The engine coughed, a weak, sputtering sound, then died. He tried again and again, the battery light mocking him with its faint glow before fading to nothing. The cabin seemed to exhale around him, a low, satisfied sigh. The truck was dead. Completely, stubbornly dead. Frustration clawed at him, a raw, burning sensation. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the horn letting out a pathetic bleat before falling silent. The entity's reach extended beyond the cabin walls. It wasn't merely haunting the structure, it was warping the very landscape around it. He scrambled out, his eyes scanning the dense tree line. The road was impassable, even if the truck had worked. He remembered an old, faded map he'd found tucked in a drawer, a crude drawing that marked the coastline and a solitary structure, an abandoned lighthouse. It was miles away, but it was a landmark, a point of reference, a chance. Perhaps there, on the edge of the world, he could find a signal, a lifeline. The thought was a thin thread of hope, but he clung to it fiercely. The canopy immediately swallowed the weak afternoon light, plunging the woods into a premature twilight. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of alarm through him. He pushed through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his clothes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees began to play tricks on his eyes. A familiar gnarled oak would suddenly shift, becoming a monstrous, indistinct shape. Paths he thought he recognized vanished, replaced by impenetrable thickets. The forest floor, once firm, seemed to undulate, making his footing uncertain. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to reorient himself, to banish the creeping tendrils of paranoia. When he opened them, the forest seemed to have tightened its grip, the trees closing in, their skeletal branches weaving a labyrinthine cage. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but the thought of the abandoned lighthouse propelled him forward. Finally, through a parting in the dense foliage, he saw it, a stark, desolate column of gray stone against the bruised sky. It was much larger, much more imposing than he'd imagined, a sentinel of solitude. Relief, sharp and sudden, pierced through his exhaustion. The structure was far from the beacon of hope he'd envisioned. Rust streaked its upper sections like weeping wounds, and the glass of its lantern room was shattered, leaving gaping, toothless holes. He pushed the door open further, stepping into a cavernous, circular room. The air was frigid, thick with the scent of brine, decay, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible smell of ash and dry blood. He moved closer, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, deeply carved into the ancient stone, was a symbol. It was crude, yet disturbingly familiar. A twisted, angular representation of a tree, its roots reaching deep, its branches contorted into something resembling clutching hands. And beneath it, etched with a precision that belied the age of the carving, were 3 letters, H-E-E-M. The lineage of hemlock. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. The lighthouse wasn't a refuge, it was another tendril of the entity's pervasive influence, another link in the chain. This wasn't just about the cabin. This entire desolate stretch of land, perhaps even beyond, was tainted. The lighthouse keeper, whoever they had been, had known. Or worse, had been part of it. He scrambled for his phone, his mind racing. No signal. Of course. His sanity, already fraying at the edges, began to unravel with terrifying speed. There was no other choice. The revelation had struck Reid like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air that felt suddenly thick with the stench of decay and salt. This wasn't just about the cabin. The lighthouse keeper, whose fragmented notes he'd found, had been consumed by the same encroaching horror. His resolve, though brittle, hardened with each step toward the towering structure that now loomed against the bruised sky. The wind, a relentless sculptor of the coast, whipped his jacket around him as he approached the abandoned lighthouse. It carried the brine of the churning ocean, but beneath it, a faint, sickly sweet odor, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, clung to the air. The iron door, rusted solid in its frame, groaned open with a wrenching shriek as Reid put his shoulder to it. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed the meager light from the doorway. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam a weak, trembling spear against the gloom. The interior was a spiral of damp, cold stone. The air was still, heavy with dust and the lingering scent of something metallic, something old and forgotten. He ascended, his hand brushing against the rough, cold stone of the inner wall, feeling the grit and grime of decades. There were no grand revelations on the lower levels, just the detritus of a life abandoned, a broken chair, a scattering of rusted tools, a single, water-stained boot. The previous keeper had left abruptly, or had been taken. It was a cramped, circular room, dominated by a cot with a threadbare blanket. On a small, rickety table, a journal lay open, its pages brittle and yellowed. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the faint, spidery script. Then, the entries grew frantic, detailing a presence, a hunger that radiated from the land, a pull that intensified with each passing night. The last entry was a single, scrawled word, bloodline. A tremor ran through Reid. He scanned the room, his eyes catching on a section of the wall that seemed just slightly off, a discoloration in the ancient stone. He pushed against it, and with a low grind of stone against stone, a hidden cavity was revealed. Inside, nestled on a shelf of rough-hewn rock, was not another journal, but a collection of ancient, leather-bound scrolls, their surfaces covered in symbols Reid had never seen before, yet felt an unsettling familiarity with. He pulled one free, unrolling it carefully. The script was archaic, but something within his mind, a latent understanding, began to piece together the meaning. It spoke of the land, not as inert earth, but as a living, hungry entity, born of the primal fear and sacrifice of a forgotten people. It was an entity of profound antiquity, predating even the oldest trees in the forest, a consciousness woven into the very bedrock. It demanded sustenance, a periodic offering to keep its ravenous hunger at bay, to prevent its slow, creeping tendrils from consuming the world beyond the forest's edge. This offering, the scrolls detailed, was not merely life, but a specific lineage, a bloodline chosen generations ago through a pact of desperation. His bloodline. The scrolls detailed the horror of the pact. In exchange for prosperity and protection from a blight that threatened to wipe out their settlement, his ancestors had promised the entity a continuous flow of life, a direct descendant to be offered at specific intervals. Not merely killed, but consumed, their essence absorbed to strengthen the entity, to fuel its ceaseless existence. The lighthouse, Reid realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just a structure, it was a beacon, a focal point for the entity's claim, a place where the barrier between worlds thinned. The keeper hadn't merely maintained the light, he had been a guardian, or perhaps, a captor, ensuring the next sacrifice could not escape. This wasn't a ghost or a curse, it was an ancient, insatiable hunger, a primordial force that saw his family not as people, but as a renewable resource. The entity fed on the essence of his ancestors, and it was now his turn. He was the current vessel, the next offering. The cabin, the forest, the lighthouse, they were all part of its vast, patient trap. As the final, horrifying truth settled in his mind, the air in the hidden chamber grew impossibly heavy. The sickly sweet odor intensified, now tinged with something metallic and acrid, like burnt bone. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the stone, seeming to rise from the very depths of the earth, a sound that was both a groan and a hungry sigh. It was the sound of the entity itself, waking, stirring, becoming aware of his presence, of his understanding. The symbols on the scrolls seemed to writhe, their lines twisting and blurring as if alive. It was reaching for him, tasting him, recognizing the familiar tang of its designated meal. He wasn't just reading about the sacrifice, he was becoming it. The demand was clear, his life, his essence, to feed the entity and maintain the fragile balance. To defeat it. The scrolls offered no path, only a grim acceptance of fate. Reid stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The entity's true nature was not a haunting, but an inheritance, a blood debt stretching back into the forgotten past. And the payment was due. This wasn't just about the cabin. This entire coastal stretch, this forgotten forest, it was all stitched together by the entity's dark tapestry. The cold, metallic taste of despair coated his tongue, but beneath it, a stubborn ember of defiance ignited. Running was pointless. Hiding was futile. The only way out was through. He stood on the wind-whipped platform of the abandoned lighthouse, the beam of its forgotten lamp long extinguished, but its purpose, now horrifyingly clear, burned in his mind. The structure wasn't a beacon of safety, it was a conduit, a siphon drawing something from the vastness beyond the shore, feeding the heart of the pack back in the cabin. He had been a fool to think he could escape its pull by seeking distance. The only path left was to sever the connection, to break the chain. The air grew heavier with every step, the salt-laced wind giving way to the cloying sweetness of damp earth and decaying leaves as he re-entered the forest path. His focus narrowed to a single point, the cabin. The nexus. The origin. As he neared the familiar clearing, the forest itself seemed to recoil, leaving a pocket of unnatural stillness. The cabin loomed, a silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. It didn't just stand there, it pulsed with a malevolent energy, a low hum that vibrated through the soles of his boots and up into his bones. This wasn't merely a house anymore, it was the entity's physical form, its manifestation on this plane. He pushed the heavy, warped door inward. Reid's gaze swept across the familiar, yet terrifyingly altered, main room. The floorboards buckled, groaning under an unseen weight. He moved towards the hearth, where he'd previously found the hidden compartment. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the raw surge of adrenaline and determination. The tattered journal, discovered days ago, spoke of a counter-ritual, a reversal of the pact. It demanded a sacrifice, not of life, but of lineage, of the very connection that bound his family to this ancient horror. From his pocket, he drew the small, tarnished silver locket he'd found amongst his relatives' personal effects, a forgotten keepsake, a relic of his own distant past. It contained a faded miniature photograph of his great-grandmother, the last living relative before the one who passed, whose eyes held a peculiar, haunted sadness he now understood. This locket, an emblem of the bloodline, would be the focal point. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wooden beams above groaned under an impossible pressure, splinters raining down like frozen tears. He placed the locket carefully on the hearthstone. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, Reid produced a small, sharp knife he'd brought. It wasn't for blood. The journal had been specific, a symbolic severing. He raised the knife, not towards himself, but towards the locket, towards the familial tie it represented. As the knife hovered, poised, the cabin screamed. It was a sound beyond human comprehension, a shriek of raw, ancient fury that tore at the very air, vibrating in his teeth, threatening to burst his eardrums. The windows shattered inwards, glass exploding across the room, yet no wind entered, only the intensified stench of decay and a sudden, crushing weight of presence. The amorphous forms in the corners lunged, their non-existent features twisting into silent, gaping maws. "You are ours." The voice was not single, but a chorus, a symphony of suffering and hunger. It was the collective consciousness of generations of pacts, of sacrifices, of the entity's slow, insidious growth. It was the true reveal, the horrifying understanding that this entity wasn't just a force, it was a living, sprawling entity woven into the very fabric of his bloodline. Sustained by the fear and the devotion of his ancestors. It was not merely a monster in the woods, it was a parasitic god, and his family had been its unwitting, willing hosts. Reid clenched his jaw, the knife shaking, but his gaze remained fixed on the locket. The pressure in the room became unbearable, as if the very air was turning to stone, crushing his lungs. But his determination held. He wouldn't become another link in that chain. He wouldn't let it consume him. With a defiant roar that was swallowed by the entity's shriek, Reid brought the knife down, not to destroy the locket, but to scrape a deep, deliberate line across its surface, a symbolic incision. A severing. A rejection of the bond. The cabin convulsed. The cold was the first thing Reid registered, a damp, penetrating chill that sank into his bones. It was a different cold than the cabin's ancient, earthbound frost. This was a briny, biting air, thick with the scent of salt and decay. He opened his eyes, or tried to, his eyelids feeling heavy as slabs of granite. Above him, a ceiling of rough-hewn timber stretched into a dim, cavernous space. He was not in the cabin. He was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar and desolate. The air tasted of rust and forgotten things. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, his vision blurring then sharpening. He was in the base of an abandoned lighthouse. The spiral staircase, a skeletal helix of iron, ascended into the gloom above, its steps groaning softly in the sea breeze that whistled through unseen cracks. The walls were rough stone, scarred with centuries of salt spray and neglect. A broken lantern lay shattered on the floor nearby, its glass shards glinting dully. Memories, fragmented and brutal, began to surface. Not a single voice, but a symphony of torment, a collective hunger that had threatened to tear him apart, atom by atom. He remembered the raw, desperate surge of his own will, a desperate, defiant refusal to be consumed. He pressed a hand to his chest, expecting to find a gaping wound, but there was nothing visible. His mind felt thinner. Certain memories, specific details of his life before the cabin, were hazy, just out of reach, like words on the tip of his tongue that refused to form. A tremor ran through his hands, a persistent, nervous vibration that he couldn't control. He looked down at them, at the pale, bruised skin, the dirt ingrained beneath his fingernails. He felt detached, observing his own body as if it belonged to a stranger. The confrontation. He had faced it. He had stared into the maw of that ancient, insatiable hunger. He had pushed back. And he had survived. But the victory felt like ash in his mouth. What had he sacrificed? What had been taken? He stumbled towards a narrow, arched window, his legs unsteady beneath him. Outside, the world was a vast expanse of gray. A tumultuous sea churned beneath a bruised sky, its waves crashing against the rocky shore with a ceaseless, mournful roar. He couldn't see it from here, but he felt its presence, or rather, its absence. The malevolence that had choked the air, that had twisted the trees and seeped into the very earth, was gone. Not vanquished, he knew, not truly destroyed, but contained. Suppressed. It was quiet. Too quiet. The entity had been driven back, forced into dormancy, but the cost. The cost was etched into his very being. He was lighter, yes, unburdened by the immediate, suffocating threat. But he was also diminished. A piece of his essence, a fragment of his soul, perhaps, had been offered, consumed, to buy his escape. His reflection in the grimy glass of the window showed a man he barely recognized, gaunt, haunted, with an unsettling blankness in his gaze. He was alive, but he felt irrevocably broken. He was safe, for now. The entity was dormant. What if a sliver of that collective consciousness, that ancient hunger, now resided within him? He shivered, despite the physical exertion. The tremor in his hands intensified. He had survived the cabin, but the horror, he knew, was far from over. It had simply found a new, more intimate host. The vast, empty horizon outside the lighthouse windows seemed to stretch into an equally vast, empty future. The cost of his survival was himself. He opened his eyes, or tried to, his eyelids feeling heavy as slabs of lead, gritty with dried particulate. A dull ache throbbed behind them, a relentless pressure. When they finally fluttered open, the world swam in a nauseating blur of gray light and corroded metal. The air tasted of rust in the ocean, a raw, untamed essence that clawed at his throat. Above him, a skeletal spiral of cast iron stairs wound upwards into the gloom, each step caked with generations of salt and neglect. This was it, then. The abandoned lighthouse. He remembered the final, desperate struggle in the cabin, the sickening lurch of reality, the tearing sound like ancient fabric rending, and then he pushed himself up, every muscle screaming in protest. His head spun, the room tilting precariously. His clothes were damp, stiff with something he didn't want to identify. Through a grimy, salt-crusted window, he saw the churning gray expanse of the sea, waves crashing against jagged rocks far below. The roar was deafening, a constant, primeval chorus that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. What had happened? He scanned the circular room. Had he won? Or had he merely fulfilled his part in a larger, more terrible design? The thought curdled in his gut. The pact. He'd resisted, he'd fought, he'd sought to break the chain. But perhaps the breaking was just another link, forged in his own desperate struggle. He stared at them, his breath catching. It smelled faintly of copper and something else, something deeply organic and deeply wrong. He wiped his hands on his trousers, but the residue seemed to cling, an invisible stain. This was the cost, he realized. Not his life, not yet, but something far more insidious. A part of him had been touched, changed, irrevocably interwoven with the threads of that ancient horror. The world, once solid and predictable, now felt thin, translucent, with unspeakable things just beyond the veil. He stumbled towards the door, the heavy iron groaning on its hinges. The lighthouse stood on a barren promontory, a bleak sentinel overlooking a raging sea. The cabin was in there, somewhere, waiting. He had to go back. Not to stay, but to retrieve what little he had left, to make a final, decisive break. The walk back through the forest was a blur of aching limbs and hyper-alert senses. He felt exposed, vulnerable, yet also strangely detached, as if viewing his own ordeal from a great distance. When he finally emerged from the tree line and saw the cabin, it looked different. Not physically changed, but its essence felt altered. It was empty, a mere shell. The entity was gone. Or, perhaps, it was simply no longer there asterisk for him to perceive in the same way. He gathered his few belongings, his hands moving automatically. The old ledger, the one that had detailed his lineage, the pact, the sacrifices, it was gone. He searched frantically, tearing through drawers, but found nothing. It was as if it had never existed, or had simply dissolved into the ether, its purpose served. The proof was gone. The truth was now solely within him. He didn't look back as he walked away, not really. He knew what he would see, a forgotten structure, unremarkable to any passerby. But to him, it was a tomb, a crucible, a monument to a horror that had twisted his very being. Days bled into weeks. He left the forest, left the region entirely, driving until the landscape shifted, until the air smelled clean, until the ocean's roar was a distant memory. He found a small apartment in a quiet town, secured a mundane job sorting inventory in a warehouse. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice felt foreign, brittle. The world was still there, vibrant and oblivious, but Reid saw it through a new, fractured lens. He tasted salt and decay in the most innocuous foods. The pact was broken, perhaps. The entity, whatever it truly was, had seemingly receded. But it had left its mark, an indelible imprint on his soul. He was a survivor, yes, but of a battle he hadn't fully understood, against an enemy he could barely comprehend. He carried the horror within him now, a constant, quiet hum beneath the surface of his perception.